Good. Well, thanks very much for coming to mine instead of going and playing with that big red dice, which I wanted to really do. But anyway, I want to talk just for 15, 20 minutes or so about the really complex problem of imagining and planning climate-compatible economies and societies in the future. And I want to refer back to some work I've done, and with a lot of other people, obviously, and give you, I hope, some idea of an approach to this very complex and difficult challenge that has been and is continually being undertaken. It's a problem that, for me, is a sort of six-dimensional issue. And I want to quickly look at those dimensions and, blast, if I can get this thing to work. And they are, first of all, that there's a CO2 problem. We all know this, okay? This is what we're about. And then there's a physical impact problem. In the coming years, we hear that there are going to be, and there are already, physical impacts, and they impact different regions in different ways, and different sectors in different ways. And then there are the economic impacts of the transition phase. As we move from one economy to the other, there are costs and there are changes in international trade, etc. And then the fourth impact is that all this has to take place in a certain time frame that science is telling us. Certain things are happening by certain times. And the next dimension is that at the same time, especially in developing countries like my own, we've got to deal with poverty and jobs and all those pressing needs of the short-term future, and we've got to apply budgets and money to them, and they compete with all these other requirements. And then the sixth dimension is that all this has to be decided by very mortal things called people, okay? People that live now. And these people that live now have to give consideration to conditions that are going to be 40, 30, 50 years from this date. So this is a really odd thing that we're tackling, and I don't think we've ever really needed to do so before. And we've also, in some funny ways, never had the tools to do this before. We've just heard about, hunter-gatherer societies. They dealt with today's problem. Today's problem is I'm hungry, I must kill a mammoth, That's it. I've got a tool. I go out and I do it. These particular problems, we now have tools that have predictive qualities that we never had only 10 years ago. We've got personal computers and models and methods of looking into the future that are becoming more and more sophisticated, and we are using these tools. So, looking first at the CO2 constraint, we have up to now done a lot of thinking about looking at the constraint as a deviation, okay? So we look into the future and we say, what will happen if we're not concerned about the carbon challenge? And then we challenge ourselves to deviate from that, quote, business as usual pathway. So we create a fiction, and then we build a future society as a deviation from that fiction. This is a little bit problematic, isn't it? Because if you get a whole lot of fictions on top of each other, and you build these fictional futures against these fictions, and you add them all up, and you ask yourself, have I done what science has required us to do? And we know that science is asking us to basically solve the carbon problem in a certain time with a certain quantum of carbon space. Then our fictions may very well overshoot that problem by a degree that is catastrophic. So far, that's exactly what's happening. The Copenhagen pledges that countries have put forward, if you add them all up and you show them up against the carbon problem and the space that we've got available, which I think is something like 500 gigatons by 2100, we are on an excursion to disaster, okay? We are only doing what is politically and economically feasible at this stage. And this deviation approach is probably part of the problem. So how do you move from the deviation approach to what I would call a budget approach? Every year our finance minister says the budget is X, and that's how much we've got, and that's what we've got to, how we fill the larder at home. What if he said, and the carbon budget for this year is X, and we can't overshoot that, okay? Or we pay, or we penalized, or whatever. So how do we begin to work within carbon budgets. And this would be the first part of the tool and the first part of the problem. The second part of the problem, so this is a kind of overlay like a GIS map. The second part of the problem is, what are the physical impacts going to be in that planning process, in using that progressive budget in a way that is frugal and conservative, and yet at the same time allows us to eat the fridge empty by the end of the year. And this is also complex because it's very difficult from downscaled models to know exactly what's going to happen with the climate. It's a very, very complicated thing. In the first South African communication on climate change, it was thought that the Western Cape, where I live, was going to get drier. And everyone was panicking and thinking, what happens to the wine industry, and so on and so forth. In the second one, published 5 years later, the models, stochastic models, whatever they're called, showed that, in fact, in the mountains, there's going to be more rain. And therefore, if you captured water, etc., etc. Okay. So it's very difficult to look at these futures, but we're getting better at doing this. And we're certainly beginning to see certain areas that look very obviously like they're in trouble. Okay. In South Africa, for example, the biggest debate at the moment is the movement of people. As people from the north stream into the country and look for the coastal parts where they are habitable and climates are still good, with Zimbabwe and places like that predicted at the moment to go 6 degrees in the wrong direction. Okay, so how do you bring all this stuff into the game? Adds the second layer of complexity. Then the third layer of complexity, and this is a very horrendous look into a model called IMACLIM, which we're looking at in Brazil, is to say, okay, now, how do we look at the impact of the whole world on this system, this economy? What's going to happen to our trade and our goods and services? How are they going to work in this world economy given certain events in this world economy during the transition phase? And to try and incorporate that layer of reality or future reality is a major challenge that people are starting to look at. Of course, in the time frame debate, if you adopt a budget approach, okay, which is everything under the green line, then the more you delay now in acting and in sticking to your budget, the more austere your future might be, unless you're lucky and you get some technologies that really pop in at scale and make it much easier for you to use a more austere carbon budget. So you might bank on that and, in a sense, gamble with the future. And we've already heard people in South Africa saying, let's just wait for China to really come up with some good concentrated solar thermal power plants. We'll buy them in 2030 or thereabouts, and we'll be able to use more carbon at the moment while we have all these real big development problems like poverty and so on, and then bank on this future. Many of you have seen this. I don't particularly like this idea of this sort of so-called beautiful sweet spot between development, mitigation, and adaptation. Okay? But the development needs are real. As you all know, those of you who especially come from countries with problems. And most of the time, my colleague Emilio from Brazil says when you show this to people, what's really happening is that the development bubble is this big and the mitigation bubble is that big and the adaptation bubble is probably even a little bit smaller. In the minds of policymakers at the moment, if you go and do a walkabout in any government, that's how they're thinking. Development, mitigation, especially in developing countries. Okay. So how do you move that and how do you balance those concerns in the practice of looking at this future plan? And finally, you've got to do this with people, and people are full of drama, and they're difficult, and they don't like each other, okay? And there are sectors that hate each other. One of the principles of the work that I've been doing is that to do this well, you've got to have competing interests at the table. In the South African process, which I'll refer to at the moment, we had 85 people at the table doing this planning work. And the NGO sector was at the table, and Sasol was at the table, which is one of our big petrochemical plants, companies rather. I'm working in Chile at the moment, and the Department of Finance said, if the NGOs are at the table, we're off the table. So people are difficult and have views about things. And that means you need to give consideration to conflict management and all sorts of soft skills of facilitation and mediation. And you've got to come up with a trick that makes people feel that they are temporarily in a safe space in which to consider this future society without having to compromise their current decisions. And this moves me on to the little story that I want to tell, which is the South African Long-Term Mitigation Scenarios project, which I co-led with a colleague of mine at the university. We had a lucky break. We were talking about failure earlier on. I can't remember how many times I've failed, but there was a little coffee shop near where Harold and I lived called Lazari. And it had great cupcakes and fantastic cappuccinos. And because we lived in the same street, we would hang out there and talk. Now, you cannot believe two different people. We are two different people. In some ways, I'm like Placido Domingo. I'm impish, naughty, and I love singing, and I do kind of really impetuous stuff, okay? Harold is German, a professor of research, methodical, a marvelous researcher and marvelous thinking person, and a modeler, okay? They work with these incredibly complex models. But we became friends, and we started to throw out two ways of thinking over these cappuccinos and started to see something happening. Basically, the common premise that we had, the two of us, was that our country, and this was 2005, is one of the highest users of the CO2 space in the world, if you consider its population and its GDP, okay? I, as a person, emit in the region of about 26 tons, looking at the average in South Africa of CO2 per year. It's higher than in the US. You compare this to India, which is about 1.8 tons. Okay. So willy-nilly, I'm an incredibly high-emitting person because our society is hugely dependent upon a large supply of cheap coal, and has been for a long time. It's a coal-dependent, heavy industry, primary industry that basically burns coal. I mean, for example, we've got 3 aluminium smelters, and people bring ingots of aluminium from Africa, and they dump it there in front of the smelter. The smelter smelts it with South African energy, and then the aluminium gets shipped right out again. So it comes to South Africa only for the energy. Okay? How's that? We have a coal-to-liquid plant that produces 61 million tons of CO2 per year. It's the highest single point emitter of CO2 in the world. So I said to Harry that, you know, right at the moment, the South African government, this is 2005, is hiding behind China and India and other big emitting non-annexed countries, saying basically the problem is the North. They must go first, okay? And I think, Harry, that this is going to run out of steam. This argument's about to die in the next 5 years, and I think we should try and prepare our country for the time when the argument basically dies. And he agreed with me, so that was our basic premise. And for once, we were right. The second part was that I had come from a world of, I'm a mediator, that's what I do, and I'd come out of a long, well, a 2-decade experience of dealing with a conflict in a country like ours where there had been a huge amount of conflict. I had been a human rights lawyer and then a mediator, and now I was a sort of climate person. So I was basically, my career was a delightful mess. But the one thing that I really wanted to do, and which I had done some of, was I wanted to do work with a large group in South Africa in looking at this problem. I didn't want to do it in a university. I wanted to do it in real life with real people. And the second thing that I really wanted to do is I wanted to try and find a way in which they would feel safe to talk about this. And I'd been doing a lot of reading about scenario work. So I thought, why don't we do scenarios, we do conflict management, we do people, and Harold knew all the modeling work. So we were going to combine the modeling work and the people. And we wrote a 3-page proposal and put that proposal to the Minister of Environment, who we happen to know, and that proposal went to Cabinet, and the next minute was a Cabinet decision and a presidential mandate was given, and we were told, do it, boys. And off we went, and we did it. And this was one of the early experiments. There have been many, many, many since then. In looking far into the future, our time horizon was 2050, and trying to work out what could happen to South Africa in terms of its carbon budget in that time. And off we went, and I call it a caper because in many ways I still don't understand why they gave us $1 million and allowed us to take a huge risk, because in some ways nobody knew what was going to happen. And governments don't like to work in those unpredictable environments. So we had a group of people who, through a long process, were selected and basically represented the leadership of all our sectors. From a relatively technical perspective, because obviously we're going to talk about relatively technical things. And we had a group of researchers who would be commissioned by this large group of sectoral leaders to do the research and modeling work. And we were very two-dimensional instead of six-dimensional. It was really people and it was CO2. The experiments I'm looking at now are trying to overlay more of the issues because we have better tools. But at that time, we had very basic modeling tools like Markel, which is an energy modeling system. And we would look at our society looking through the lens of the carbon budget of CO2. So the first scenario we very quickly built in one afternoon was, what would science require South Africa to do? And our emissions at the time were 443 million tons of CO2 per annum. This was in 2003. And basically, using IPCC science, science would require us to reduce those emissions absolutely by 2050 by between 30 and 40%, giving ourselves a 50% discount against developed countries who would have to do 60 to 80%, I think was the IPCC AR4 at the time. So this was quickly agreed by everybody. This was utopia. Okay, nice, put the line there. Okay, and now let's get on with the real work. And the real work was first to build what is called the baseline. So now you can see we're already on that deviation route, which was very fashionable in those days and still is, okay? So we built our baseline, but we built it very, very carefully. Our group had to agree everything. We had to agree what would happen to the population of South Africa in relation to mortality and AIDS. We had to try and divine the oil price through to 2050. Given what Tim had just said, you can imagine how wrong we were. We weren't far wrong. We had one scenario which was $150, but I'm sure the oil price is not going to be $150 in 2050. We had to look at the price of uranium. We had to look at the technology learning of supercritical coal. And we had to take into account a vast number of factors that would be used as inputs and assumptions. And then we would say, here's a society. This is what it more or less looks like from an energy perspective. How is it going to flourish between now and 2050? What will happen to its emissions, according to this model, if we just have an unconstrained, successful society? No care in the world about climate change. After we'd done 8 months of work and put all these components into the system, we were able to press the button and we all got a terrible shock, because this is what happened with the growth without constraints. South Africa's emissions climbed to 4 times where they are today. Now, this is where the data is not so important, okay? Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. But the point is that even if the GDP figures were too high and too generous, and in fact, because of the financial crisis, we're going to do much worse than we thought. What happened here was that for the first time, people had the experience which we as mediators say is central to conflict resolution, and that is doubt. For the first time, they felt, wait, maybe we can't do that. Because maybe if China and India and others do that to their economies, using the same principle of we are immune for now, we will be in the problem area that we're trying to avoid. And the second thing that enters into people's minds after they've had this experience of doubt is a more positive experience, and that is the experience of challenge. So everyone looked at this and said, well, let's see what we can do with that and see if we can actually improve on that. And so they built a number of scenarios which showed a further level of effort. And so the first exhibition of ambition against the normal path of the economy began to emerge. This was a kind of, let's take what we're doing in policy terms today and just extrapolate it up to 2050. It certainly didn't perform very well. So everyone could see that the government is hanging its head a little bit and going, okay, right, what we've got on the table right now is not very effective. Now remember, South Africa is a very coal-driven economy. So we've got a problem now. We've got a 1,300 megaton problem, and we need to get rid of it. So what we did was we sent every sector off into little groups, and we said, what's the best you can do conservatively over the next 30 years? So the group that dealt with electric vehicles went off into there, and the group that did hybrids, and the group that did how to deal with cow poo, enteric fermentation, and the aluminium group, and the cement group, and the this group, and the that group went off, and they did what really are these little exercises, wedges of activity in reducing the carbon budget of your particular economic activity.
Stefan, can I just remind you that we'd like to have a little time to...
Yeah, I'm nearly there. And these could then be put together into a number of scenarios. Okay, so this, for example, is a scenario where you take half of the coal out of South Africa. And this is a scenario where you take all the coal out of South Africa. And the sad fact is that you're still not there. Okay. So you start beginning to realize the monumental challenge that sits ahead of us. This particular exercise, and I am going to cut short because I really want to hear you. This particular exercise had a phenomenal effect on the people in the room. Because instead of starting off by saying, there's the problem, what's the solution? They started off by saying, let's explore the components of an exercise showing us pictures of the future. Today, this exercise is being incorporated in the long-term economic planning of the country. Okay, so it had a huge impact on people out there. And today, we're trying similar but more dimensional exercises in Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru through a project where I'm working with country leaders in those countries. So this is just a brief suggestion of the type of approach, the combination of modeling, the combination of human beings, leadership, and the way they think and operate, and the combination of these other dimensions, these factual dimensions, the carbon constraint, the developmental constraint, and the impacts constraint, and how they can be brought together, and we can look in a safe space at the future and say, what if we did this? What would the impacts be? It's been quite a ride for me, being part of this project, which has been going on since 2005. It's now 6 years. And I don't think we've got the answers yet. I don't think we've solved the technologically and general complexity of the problem. I don't think that these predictions are necessarily perfect or accurate. But what I do think is happening in these processes is that people are changing. And I think that's their fundamental success. Thanks very much.